I'm back from summer break, and I brought some snacks. I had a great time while I was off, but I am ready to get back into making some more content. And admittedly, when I have a lot of spare time, I make things that might not make a whole lot of sense. But I have always been really curious about 3D printing with food. I've seen chocolate, I've seen pancakes, and I have seen cheese before. But most of the time when you see cheese, they're actually creating a different object out of that cheese that would be edible. I wanted a way to automate the delivery of that cheese. So I took my log 3D printer and I converted it into an aerosol cheese delivery system. And before we get started, here's some high-res footage of a single cracker deployment, just so you get the idea of what we're getting ready to do here. And who doesn't love canned cheese, right? So let me show you a little bit about how I built this system and how I got it to all work together. No need to refrigerate. That's probably not good. And before I go more in depth of how I created this, here's the whole mechanism as a whole after a completed run. I have a plate that holds the vessel, in this case a cracker. I laid out 9 of them. I probably could have done more, but I thought 9 was a pretty good place to start. We have a holder for the cheese front and back that holds the Nemo 17 motor as well. This is a fairly large Nemo 17 because I needed the extra torque to energize that can. And I modeled it towards the stock Mark II plate that holds the X-axis on a Mark II Prusa printer. So I started this project in Fusion 360. I even redrew the can of cheese to make sure that I had the layout just right. The rack and pinion system I used to actually trigger the can was borrowed from the Snappy printer design. It was altered quite a bit, but it's pretty much the same rack it uses for the X and Y. So when I first started designing this whole thing, the first thing I did was come up with a cracker plate. I figured you wouldn't want the crackers to be moving around while you were trying to deploy the cheese. It might try to drag them back and forth, so I just created this. So pretty much all I did was measure some crackers with my calipers. Yeah, not something I ever thought I'd do in life. And just designed this sheet to hold 9 of them, and it came out pretty well. There was really no iterations of this. First time, it just worked. And then I started to look at how you would actually hold a can of cheese on your X carriage like this. I wanted it to be simple, and I wanted to be able to push the can up and down because I wasn't quite sure where the can placement would be. So I just went with this cup design that bolts directly to that X carriage, using the existing holes, and then there's a piece that goes on the front that kind of sandwiches the can in using some M3x50 screws, so I can adjust it if I need to. And then the next hurdle was, with this can of cheese on the front, you couldn't get to the end stop any longer. So I developed this piece. You can see the holder prevents it from homing X. So rather than reinventing this X carriage piece, I just made this piece that goes on the existing actuator, just makes it longer. So now you can home X. So now I had a way to hold the can on the printer. Now I needed to figure out how to actuate it. And that's where this slide and track come in. I developed these by themselves and then just attached them to the mounting plate on the bottom. Again, I borrowed this design from the Snappy, but I added a track on the bottom and I extended this part up because if you use this flat, the motor would actually be too low and you couldn't clear the print bed. So I just extended it up like this and it worked out great. It just slides in like so, and I cut a V in the end of it so the nozzle of the can rests right there. It also kind of lets you home the extruder on the can. Since there's no end stop for an extruder, you just push this right up against the nozzle, then you know the distance every time of how much pressure it's going to take to actuate the can. The gear that drives the rack, I didn't change it at all. It's directly from one of my other Snappy builds. I just made the front bracket so it would hold a Nemo 17 motor, with a bottom section that kind of locks it in place. Like so, just 2 M3x45mm screws here to hold it top and bottom. And the whole thing mounts on the front with the can in the middle. There's the whole thing assembled once again. And from the top, you can see how the gear turns to move the slide over to actuate that can. I started testing this with a Nemo 17 40mm motor. It just didn't have enough torque to be able to actuate the can. It does take quite a bit of pressure, so I switched it out with this 60 motor, and it handles it just fine. So after a few different iterations designing those parts, I started to find stuff that worked out pretty well together. It did take me a little while to figure out that I was going to need a bigger motor because there just wasn't enough torque on that 40mm to actuate the can. And believe me, during testing, there was a lot of mishaps, like this one. So much cheese was lost during this project, but science. So up until this point, I was just using Pronterface to move the printer around and execute the extruder in really small movements, and I'm pretty sure that there's still no slicer available for cheese dispensing types of machines, so I had to write the G-code by hand. And here's a look at the G-code. I did have about 10 test runs before I found the parameters that would work well, but basically all I do is home the printer as usual. The log design does use a probe by default, so I just attached a manual end stop switch on the side. It was kind of a crude addition, but it did seem to work out. But then I just moved the print head around where I thought the cheese needed to go, and I recorded that with an M114 command. So with a G1, I would send it to its coordinates. At Z0 is where I would deploy the cheese. I'd move the extruder 1.2 millimeters at a feed rate of 200. I'd wait for a second with the G4 command. Then I'd move up 10 millimeters while moving the extruder back to 0 to relieve pressure off the nozzle of the can. And then after I had all that down, it was pretty much just rinse and repeat for each one of the cracker locations. At the very end, I'd move the cheese can up 100 millimeters and the cycle would be done. There were a couple of other hurdles to jump over, like in Marlin, I had to use a dummy thermistor that constantly reads 25C because I didn't have an extruder thermistor. And you can't compile Marlin without at least one heater. I did have to up the voltage a bit on the extruder, and the whole thing was powered by the mini Rambo board. Now that you've seen how I built it, here's the part of the video that you've been waiting for. This is the printer executing on all 9 crackers. And there we have it, my friends. Automated cheese delivery success. Now, this wasn't the easiest project to tackle by any means, but it did get me thinking more creatively. And sometimes it takes a project like this to get you back in the right mindset. So no matter how ridiculous your project might seem, I urge you to go ahead and create it, because you never know what you might learn on that project that you can take to the next project. Hopefully you found this video entertaining. If you did, please consider giving it a thumbs up or subscribing to my channel. If not, leave your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching. I never want to eat a cheese cracker ever again.